Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, one of the most important of the Founding Fathers, and simply one of the most interesting, philosophically and intellectually, men of the late 18th century. The influences that made up his political thought drew from various strands of the Enlightenment. Through and through, Jefferson, more than perhaps any of the other Founding Fathers, with the possible exception of Benjamin Franklin, is truly a figure of the Enlightenment, a European and Atlantic-wide intellectual movement. Jefferson knew the French Enlightenment. Jefferson knew the Scottish Enlightenment. And Jefferson's ideas are deeply influenced by these various strands of Enlightenment. He knew and absorbed the thought of the Scottish Enlightenment, Francis Hutcheson, whom we've explored, David Hume, and eventually Adam Smith. Jefferson knew the French philosophes of the late 18th century. He was profoundly interested in the latest scientific thought of the day, and indeed his thought was as scientific as it was philosophical and political. So Jefferson is through and through a man of the Enlightenment. He's also the representative figure of a particularly American synthesis of republicanism. And we want to consider Jefferson as a Republican theorist. Jefferson's republicanism represents a particularly American synthesis of republicanism, an ancient political ideology reaching back into the world of Greece and Rome, but one that finds a new form of expression in the context of the 18th century, and one that is to be challenged almost immediately by the social transformations that will engulf the modern world. Jefferson's view of republicanism is deeply imbued with a sense of English history, and Jefferson believes that the colonists are the heirs of an ancient tradition of freedom that goes back to the Saxons. Jefferson believes that American freedom is in some way the heir of the Saxon legacy, the Angles and the Saxons, Germanic tribes that he believed moved out of the woods of northern Europe and settled as free men on the soil of the British Isles. And Jefferson believes in particular that when they did so, the Saxons had a kind of set of free institutions, trial by jury, equality, and especially free ownership of land. And for Jefferson, this is very important because he believes that the Saxons held their lands in complete freedom, that it was not held with obligations to a king. Jefferson believes that the Saxons hold their land under a certain specific kind of tenure, fee simple or allodial tenure, which simply means that they hold their land with complete ownership rights over it without any kind of encumbrance, without any kind of obligation to the king, that it is their property. Now, this is very different from the feudal way of landholding, and we'll talk over the next several lessons about feudalism. Feudalism is a medieval concept. In fact, it can mean very many different things. It can mean a system of society which is strictly hierarchical with a king and his lords and their knights, underneath them free men, underneath them serfs, all with different obligations to their superiors. Feudalism can mean a system of landholding in which particular estates, particular properties are held by individuals, but only on certain conditions, that the land is encumbered with certain kinds of obligations, for instance, service to the king or service to a lord, that it's held hereditarily. In other words, that there are rules, for instance, of primogeniture or of entail, which say that a property, an estate, can't pass out of a certain bloodline, that it's encumbered with certain obligations and it must remain within a family that holds those obligations. Jefferson believes that there's a feudal order of landholding in which land can have all sorts of encumbrances and obligations to higher powers. And he believes that this feudal order only came into Britain with the Norman invasion, William the Conqueror, in the 11th century. And he believes that underneath this, there survives a tradition of Saxon landholding in fee simple, in this unencumbered land, and that this kind of freedom, this kind of ownership, is different from any kind of feudal ownership because it means that the person who owns this land doesn't owe it to a superior, to a lord, or above all, to the king. And so Jefferson's republicanism is rooted in this vision of English history that sees a kind of freedom that goes back to the Saxons and that embodies a certain kind of property ownership. Jefferson's republicanism, further, is a deeply agrarian republicanism. And here Jefferson draws on the ancient tradition, but particularly the Roman tradition, that says that virtue is essential for freedom and self-governance. And we've seen this ideology in the Roman writers, in Cicero, for instance. It's very different from a Greek tradition that goes back to Aristotle and which devalues the farmer. For the Romans, the ideal republican citizen is a virtuous and independent farmer who serves his state, who serves in the army, and who is also a property owner. And we see how the crisis of the Republic, the late Republic in Rome, is a crisis of the small farmer, a crisis of citizenship. And Jefferson knows these texts. He knows these ideas. And Jefferson comes to embody a particularly agrarian vision of American republicanism. Jefferson believes in farmers. He believes that for America to be a free state, it must be a society of farmers, a society of agriculturalists. Jefferson says, very famously, in his notes on the state of Virginia, that those who labor on the land are the chosen people of God. For Jefferson, there's something about the way of life, of living on the land, that nurtures an independent spirit, that nurtures self-reliance, that wasn't to be found in other ways of life. Jefferson didn't believe in cities. He believed that they were so many cankers on the body politic. Jefferson didn't believe in manufactures. He thought that people who worked for wages were necessarily servile, that they had to obey those upon whom they depended. Jefferson had a vision that the agricultural life offered independence, that it nurtured virtue in a way that was essential for the American Republic to survive. And so Jefferson's political thought is a complex body of ideas, but at its core is this vision, a social vision of virtuous, independent, landowning, free men who will be the foundation of a republic.